It's like what kind of another process is regulated.
And there's been a request from people who are listening in their offices that we all make sure we remember to use our microphones. And since you're not going to need a microphone back here, I'm going to get 2 microphones delivered.
Okay, back on the record.
Thank you, Commissioner. At the break, we were looking at Mr. Parker's testimony, the sentence on page 51, lines 1 to 2, and we had come to the point where you had an exhibit that you wanted to introduce. I believe we've given copies to council now. Can you tell us, this is marked for identification, CLF
21, and it's the ISO New England 2015 Regional System Plan, and it is pages 157 to 168 inclusive.
Mr. Fagan, can you tell us what this document is?
Yes. This is section 10, entitled The Integration of Variable Energy Resources from ISO New England's published 2015 Regional System Plan, published in November of 2015.
What does this document show, and what is its relevance to the matter under discussion about whether or not the CREC facility would be needed if more renewables are built?
In short, this document describes what is needed or what studies are needed for ISO New England to successfully and reliably integrate higher levels of variable output or so-called intermittent resources. And in summary, there are 3 points that I would make as they relate to this document. The first point is that in the beginning portion of this document, ISO New England talks about its wind integration study and what's required to allow increasing levels of wind on the system. And it's primarily focused on northern New England. And the main point that you take from reading through this information is that it's important to increase the level of voltage support devices that exist on the system up in northern New England, and that will be an important means of making sure the system is more reliable when greater levels of wind are integrated in northern Maine. In northern New England, including especially northern Maine. The second point that I would make with respect to this document is in talking about photovoltaic integration, its lead recommendation is to improve forecasting techniques. A lot of the solar PV in New England is behind the meter, and ISO New England doesn't have as much information about that, and they would want to make sure that they had a better sense of the magnitude and the location, I presume, of all of those resources, because it's important for them to be able to forecast the output of solar resources as accurately as they can. And then the third thing, and all of these relate to the information on page 51 of Mr. Parker's testimony, but perhaps the third element that's most relevant is that ISO New England does indeed state, and I quote from page 164 of this section, that they have a need to better understand the impacts of system operations on the increasing amounts of DG, which is an acronym for distributed generation, including ramping, reserve, and regulation requirements. And I'll note that nowhere in this document...
Excuse me, where are you on page 164?
I'm sorry, at the very top, the second bullet.
Thank you.
Nowhere in this document does it say we need to install more resources like CREC to make sure we can operate our system. That doesn't mean that CREC wouldn't provide the characteristics that are needed to have proper operating reserves. But there's plenty of resources on the system now and future system resources that can certainly provide this need. So I just wanted to point out that this document, ISO New England's current information, does not say we need to have large-scale combined cycle resources in order to integrate renewables into our system. They say, rightly so in my opinion, we need to do these things first. Make sure we're good on voltage for wind, make sure we're good on our forecasting of the output of resources, solar resources. I mean, that pertains to wind also. And yes, let's continue to study the operational effects and whether or not we need additional ramping and regulation requirements, for example. I'll note that the current operating reserve requirements, regulation, spinning reserve, non-spinning reserve, those things, ancillary services that are thought of as critical for reliable operation, are based on what would happen to the system if we lose large elements, large transmission line, large generators. So they keep in reserve a lot of capacity to address those contingencies. That capacity that's kept in reserve is absolutely available to handle the fluctuations that occur as a result of variable output resources. And I'll note that this is not a newfangled thing. System operators have been dealing with the variability of load day in, day out for decades. So it's not some new thing that because of solar and because of wind, we suddenly have to deal with variability on the system. That's what ISO New England does, and they do that well, in my opinion.
And is this excerpt of the 2015 Regional System Plan published by ISO New England the type of document that you use in your research?
Yes, there's a lot of documents. I just wanted to at least pull out at a high level, here's some of the key concerns associated with integrating variable resources at this point in time.
And did you in fact use this document in preparing your pre-file testimony?
Yes, I sort of regularly look at the regional system plans at different levels of detail for different reasons.
I'd like to move the admission of CLF 21 as a full exhibit.
No objection.
May be so omitted.
Thank you, Commissioner. What role, if any, do Hydro Quebec imports play in responding to flexibility needs on the ISO New England system?
Objection.
Are you referencing something in Mr. Parker's, you were providing a statement of Mr. Parker's testimony?
We're still on page 51, lines 1 and 2, where Mr. Parker asserts that if more renewables are built, their inherent intermittency would increase ISO's need for resources like CREC. So we're talking about flexibility in the ISO system, and we're pointing out that there are other resources that are available to meet the purported need served by CREC.
Okay, I'll allow it.
Do you have the question in mind, or do you need to have the stenographer read it back to you?
No, I have the question. In short, the imports from Hydro Quebec are scheduled on an hourly basis. I don't know that they can be scheduled more frequently than hourly. But that means that they're dispatchable to a certain degree, a significant degree. Therefore, they contribute to having flexible resources available to the system.
On page 51, at lines 2 and 3, Mr. Parker says, Mr. Fagan's claim that peak load could decline in the future is inconsistent with ISO New England's forecast, unquote. What is your response?
Sorry, which page was that?
I'm sorry, it's page 52. I apologize for my error. Looking at lines 2 and 3, Mr. Fagan's claim that peak load could decline in the future is inconsistent with ISO New England forecast.
Oh, actually, it's completely consistent with their forecast, and that's what my evidence is demonstrating. Figure 7 and 8, for example, show the New England net peak load forecast and the Rhode Island net peak load forecast. The Rhode Island net peak load forecast, this is ISO New England's projection in the 2016 CELT, has a compound annual growth rate that's negative. New England's net peak load forecast has a compound annual growth rate that's relatively small, 0.17%. This is figure 7.
I'm sorry, could I ask where those figures
Yeah,
are?
what page are you on?
Oh, sure. This is page 23 of my testimony.
Okay, so in the future though, if you refer to a graph or a figure in your testimony, if you could also refer to the page that it's on. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Am I making a claim that the peak load could decline in the future? Yes. What's that claim based on? It's based on my observation of ISO New England forecast data. And not only is it based on looking at these figures, what figure 7 in particular shows is a series of projections made by ISO New England over the past 7 years, going back to the 2010 CELT report. What the series demonstrate, the CELT 2010, 2011, etc., is that with each succeeding year, the ISO New England's projection of 10-year forward compound annual growth rate of net peak load has declined. So for example, you don't see the number on this chart, but the 2010 CELT had a 1.6% 10-year forward compound annual growth rate. In 2014, that was down to 0.67%. And in 2016, that was down to 0.17%. Rhode Island, similar trends. Rhode Island has actually gone negative in this year's CELT. So that, it's based on a series of vintage forecasts and my understanding of what's driving that I make my claim that it's entirely feasible, if not reasonable, to think that the net peak load forecast in New England, will indeed go to zero or decline. ISO New England has already acknowledged that it's certainly flattening. The data is very clear. But I just wanted to point out that it is completely consistent with ISO New England data to talk about a declining net peak load forecast in the future. And that has direct implications for what the ICR and the net ICR would be. And therefore, it has all sorts of implications for what reliability will look like, what capacity permits will need to be made, etc.
You said that the ISO figures showing declining peak load have all sorts of implications for net ICR. What are those implications?
ICR is based in a significant part on the projected peak load forecast. That's the primary implication. That as load declines, ICR will tend to decline. It's not the only factor in computing ICR, but it's an important one.
And you said that those ISO figures showing declining peak load have all sorts of implications for ISO's reliability needs. What are those implications?
Well, the main implication is that in the future, you go out to the mid-2020s, for example, you're easily looking at hundreds, if not thousands, of megawatts of difference in what the projected need might be. That's the primary indication.
So on page 52, at lines 11 to 12, and then at lines 14 to 15, Mr. Parker says, page 52, Mr. Parker says, quote, "I am reluctant to second guess ISO New England's forecast of BTM PV. This forecast was vetted through a regional stakeholder process," and then continuing on 14, "I do not believe Mr. Fagan has greater insight in future BTM PV development on New England than ISO New England," unquote. What is your response, Mr. Fagan?
This portion of my testimony is addressing information on the data that exists on ISO New England's projections of solar PV in New England. And at pages 25 and 26 of my testimony, in figures 9, 10, and 11, and I can cut to the chase and go right to figure 11. What this shows, in figure 11, the bottom dotted line was ISO New England's forecast of solar PV in 2014. The middle dotted line is ISO New England's forecast in 2015, and the top solid line is ISO New England's forecast in 2016. And what you can tell directly from this graph, ISO New England's data, for example, in 2023 or thereabouts, in 2014, ISO New England had projected 1,500 megawatts of solar PV. In 2016, that number was closer to 3,000. That's an enormous difference. That's a 1,500 megawatt, roughly, installed capacity, solar PV capacity. Now that turns into a smaller amount of capacity that they credit for reliability purposes because they discount solar PV. But nonetheless, it's an enormous difference. What ISO New England has said is that they based their 2016 projection based on the results of this working group and based on information on the trends in the past. Going forward, solar PV costs continue to decline dramatically, rapidly. State policies in New England generally favor the installation of solar PV. It's not unreasonable to think that solar PV installations in New England will continue apace. So it's not unreasonable to think that even this forecast for 2016 could be lower than what the actual numbers will be. Do I have a forecast? No, I do not. The main point that I'm making is that looking at the recent history, ISO New England has underestimated the level of PV for future years, and that has very important implications for what the net peak load forecast will be and what the resulting ICR and net ICR will be.
Mr. Fagan, looking at Mr. Parker's testimony on page 52, at lines 17 to 18, Mr. Parker has a subhead in which he says, quote, "Mr. Fagan's opinions on long-term resource forecasts are not relevant to the DPUC determination of need," unquote. I will note that I believe Mr. Parker meant PUC, not DPUC. And this section of Mr. Parker's testimony continues at the top of page 54 at line 6. What is your response to Mr. Parker?
Well, in short, I think projections of long-term need are critically important when you're investigating questions of need. These are long-lived assets. There's been mention of the role that at-risk units that might retire would play. It has a bearing. Mr. Parker is referencing a table in my testimony where I look at ISO New England's forecast of need. This is on page 29 of my testimony, at figure 12. by ISO New England's own document from that same 2015 Regional System Plan, taking into account the resources that were cleared in FCA 9, which is important. They show that there's actually a resource surplus. That's their term. Going out to 2023, 2024. And in this table, they then show a resource shortage of 31 megawatts in 2024, 2025. Now, I'll note two key things when you're looking at this table. This is a table from the end of 2015, prior to the 2016 SELT. 2016 SELT demonstrated a significantly lower peak load forecast. And I believe that this table also does not take into account the effect of the retirement of Pilgrim. But taking those two factors into account, it still demonstrates that ISO New England has said that there is a surplus out to the middle portions of the 2020s.
You have another question, Mr. Elmer?
Yes, I do. I'd like to direct your attention to what has been marked for identification as CLF 19. This appears to be a PowerPoint presentation by Maria Scibelli, spelled S-C-I-B-E-L-L-I. Could you tell us what this document is?
This is a document from May of 2016. I think its title says a lot, the assumptions for calculating the installed capacity requirements. I'll note that that's for FCA 11, the 2020-2021 period. And this document...
Go ahead, I don't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to say that the key piece of information in this document is on the second to last page. Doesn't mean that the other information is not relevant, but one of the key pieces of information is towards the bottom of that second to last page. There's an indication, and the left-hand margin is slightly cut off, but the indication is NICR for New England, 2020-2021 FCA, 34,010 megawatts. Now, they do indicate that this is preliminary. But what that preliminary indication is that for that year, for that capacity commitment period, 2020-2021, the net ICR is roughly 141 megawatts lower than what the net ICR was for FCA 10, which was for an earlier year. So it's a fairly important piece of data that we don't have final NICRs now, but what this is indicating is that going forward into 2020, the installed capacity requirements, the net installed capacity requirements, are even lower than what they had projected them to be for the prior year.
And can you tell from the notation at the top of the cover sheet where this presentation was made?
Yes, the PSPC meeting number 318. That's I believe it's the Power Supply Planning Committee at ISO New England, if I'm not mistaken, that acronym.
And did you use the material in this exhibit in preparing for your testimony here today?
Yes.
I'd like to ask that this be admitted as a full exhibit.
No objection. No objection.
Maybe so admitted.
Before we leave the subject of Mr. Parker's testimony completely, I want to ask you some broad, overarching questions. Is the Invenergy proposed...
Are these going to be relative to Mr. Parker's testimony, though?
They will be relative to the testimony of Messrs. Nyland and Hardy yesterday. Were you here yesterday when Mr. Nyland testified to his belief that the Invenergy facility is needed by the ISO to to maintain system reliability.
Yes, I was.
Do you agree?
No, I don't.
Why?
In short, as I've stated, system reliability is met if you have sufficient installed capacity requirements or net installed capacity requirements. Right now, ISO New England has projected those for 2019, 34,151 megawatts. In the most recent auction, there was a surplus of 1,416 megawatts that were cleared. Indications are going forward that we may even see lower net ICR requirements by the time we get to that year. That tells me that right now we have a relative surplus of capacity based on the capacity supply obligations that exist for 2019.
Were you in the room yesterday when there was discussion about how the growth of renewable resources in New England provide an argument for approving the Invenergy plant?
I believe I was, yes.
Do you agree with that?
Objection. I think we've heard his testimony on every one of these subjects extensively this morning. Again, I think Mr. Elmer is just repeating the same line of questions and responses again.
Can you repeat the question, Mr. Elmer?
Does the growth of renewable resources in New England provide a sound argument for approving the Invenergy proposal?
Well, I'm going to allow it, but I think we're starting to continue to go down the road. So let's move forward. But I'll allow it at this point.
No, the growth of renewable energy resources in New England does not provide a sound argument for approving the proposed new energy plan.
Do you have Ryan Hardy's pre-filed testimony in front of you, the original April 22nd?
I do not.
Do you have that here?
Yes.
On page 3, at lines 3 to 4, Mr. Hardy is asked, is the FCM the free market mechanism that determines the need for new generating units in ISO New England, unquote? And his answer starts on line 5, yes. Is the FCM a free market mechanism?
Objection. Same objection. Just asking, he's already provided testimony in response to Mr. Ryan's pre-filed testimony in his testimony dated, the date, but when he filed it, he responded to every one of these statements already. They were just repeating.
No, he has not addressed the question of whether the FCM is a free market mechanism.
Well, did you ask him to refer to Mr. Hardy's original pre-filed testimony?
Yes, I did.
And did Mr. Fagan file his pre-filed testimony subsequent to that testimony of Mr. Hardy?
Yes, he did.
Okay. So he had an opportunity to address this then, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Okay, I'm going to sustain the objection.
Thank you, Commissioner. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Mr. Shore?
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Fagan.
Good morning.
Mr. Fagan, I'm Alan Shore. I represent Invenergy in this proceeding. Let's start. You asked. We were talking a little bit just a while ago about the renewables and the questions regarding your views that the project is not needed to support continued growth of renewables. Do you just remember that discussion?
Yes.
All right. Have you specifically analyzed the New England market needs and how they would be affected by adding renewables to the ISO New England market?
I haven't done a specific analysis, but I have looked at the ISO New England documentation around this, and I'm aware of the characteristics of the existing resource base that exists in New England. So to some extent, I'm very familiar with the situation as it exists right now. I rely primarily on ISO New England's fairly clear description of what's required in that regional system plan, for example, in addition to relying upon my knowledge of renewable resource integration in general.
So you haven't done any analysis on your own, correct?
I haven't done any production cost modeling, for example, that might reveal whether or not there were ancillary requirement shortages. But what I do know is that given the magnitude of the existing flexible resource base in New England, and given what exists now and what's likely to exist in the near term, and ISO New England's indications, does not seem to be any kind of an immediate need for new resources to provide the ancillary services that might be required. They may need to adjust the operating reserve requirements on the system to make sure that they have enough operating reserve from within the pool of total resources that exists.
So you don't know how the net installed capacity requirement, the NICR that you referred to, you don't know how that would be affected by the increase of more renewables on the system right now, right?
Well, actually, I do know a little bit. The net ICR was computed for 2020, for example, and the net ICR was computed, the preliminary net ICR was computed for 2020, and the actual net ICR was computed for 2019. So that is an indication of a differential net ICR, so to speak. The net ICR went down as we moved from 2019 to 2020. Projections of solar PV installations continue to increase through 2020. So that's one data point in the near term.
Okay, so you think that the ISO New England has taken into account these issues in their forward capacity auction process?
They state that that's what they do when they compute the installed capacity requirements. That includes what installed capacity is required for ancillary service provision.
And that you're relying, as you said, I believe, on the work and the forecast that the New England ISO has put out with regard to how they are anticipating adjustments to the system that are needed to account for more and more renewable energy resources. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. I do rely on the ISO New England documentation as it exists now, certainly up through 2020, 2021.
Could I mark the exhibit?
Energy Exhibit 7 for ID is ISO New England 2015 Regional Electricity Output, pages 24 through 28 inclusive.
Mr. Fagan, do you see that document in front of you?
Yes, can I ask what the date is for this document?
Well, it says on the bottom of the front page, it says ISO New England 2015 Regional Outlook.
Yes, I'm asking when it was published.
I'm just referring to the bottom where it says 2015 Regional Outlook. My understanding, it was March of 2016.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Fagan, is this, so this is a document that's put out by ISO New England, correct?
Yes, 2020.
Okay, and in your testimony, I believe you said that you're placing great reliance on the ISO New England documents in supporting your opinions and your testimony, correct?
I didn't say great reliance. I do rely on them, but I also look at them with skepticism, where I think that may be required.
So you're relying on ISO New England documents with skepticism?
No, that's not what I said. You said that I rely. You characterized my testimony as like great reliance. I would not characterize my testimony as great reliance. I would characterize my testimony as, yes, I certainly rely on these documents,
Okay.
but they're not infallible.
All right, I want you to look on the second page where this is a chapter, it's titled Integrating Renewables. You see that?
Yes.
I want you to turn to page 25 of that document, where the heading says Fuels with Complex Characteristics. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. The first sentence of that says, wind and solar resources will eventually help achieve federal and state environmental goals, period. Paradoxically, the operating characteristics of these renewable resources, which are different than traditional power plants, will increase reliance on fossil fuel-fired natural gas generators. You see that statement?
Yes, I do.
Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, with some caveats.
And the next bullet points, I want to read that. It says, wind and solar resources can have rapid and sizable swings in electricity output due to wind speed, time of day, cloud cover, haze, and temperature changes, which is why they are called variable or intermittent resources, end paren. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, I do. As I also would agree that load can see rapid and sizable swings, and other resources occasionally can see rapid and even more sizable swings in their output.
Okay, and then on the next bullet where it says the resources have limited ability to serve peak load. These resources have a limited ability to serve peak load. The resources that ISO is referring to here are the renewable energy resources, correct?
I presume that that middle bullet paragraph is referring to the wind and solar resources in the bullet above it.
Thank you. And then it goes on to say that wind speeds can be at their lowest levels in the summer, while extreme cold and ice can also hinder output. Widespread use of solar, power, will likely shift peak net load to later in the afternoon, just as output diminishes with the setting sun. You see that?
I see it.
Do you agree with that statement?
The whole paragraph?
Yes.
I would have to parse it, which I will. The first sentence says these resources have a limited ability to serve peak load. Well, the resources have an ability to serve peak load to some extent, and ISO New England documents that. For example, solar resources are afforded a particular capacity credit. Wind resources, onshore wind resources are afforded a relatively lower capacity resource credit because they do have a lesser ability to serve peak load in the summertime. This sentence does not get into whether or not offshore, if we're talking about offshore wind resources, and in the future, offshore wind resources have a different set of characteristics, such that I would think that wind speeds can be at their lowest levels in the summer. That's not the case for offshore wind resources, for example. The next thing, while extreme cold and ice can also hinder output. That's true, it can hinder output, but doesn't necessarily eliminate the ability for wind resources to provide capacity support in the winter. But generally, ISO New England currently still bases its reliability on what's happening in the summer. So I would say that extreme cold and ice don't have an immediate bearing on near-term reliability because because near-term reliability is based on what's happening during the summer. Widespread use of solar power will likely shift net peak load to later in the afternoon, just as the output diminishes with the setting sun. Absolutely. It will indeed do that. And that's why we have the rest of the system to continue to provide energy as we move into the later afternoon and early evening hours. This has been seen much more dramatically in California, which has a much higher level of solar resources, and they've been addressing it in a significant amount of detail. But what this points out is, yes, indeed, we may no longer see a 27,000 megawatt peak at 2 p.m. We might see instead a 24,000 megawatt peak at 5:30 p.m. That's how I interpret that paragraph. So yes, all of this is true.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, okay, on the next paragraph, where the next paragraph down, where it says, to balance the variable output from wind and solar resources, the power system must hold more fast start capability in reserve, period. The types of units that can come online quickly are typically natural gas generators and large-scale pump storage. Do you see that?
I see that.
Do you agree with that sentence? Yes or no?
Objection. I think the witness ought to be able to answer the question fully.
Well, you're right, he can explain his answer, however, he does need to confine his answer to the question.
Okay. Sure, there's two sentences there. Can I take each one? The first one says, to balance the variable output from wind and solar, the system must hold more fast start capacity in reserve. The system needs to hold fast start capacity in reserve, not just because of balancing of wind and solar. It needs to hold fast start capacity in reserve because actually, I'm sorry.
You're going, she's doing her best to take down everything you say, so you'll have to slow down a little bit.
Sure. In general, the system needs to hold fast start capacity. That's because part of the planning is for contingency events. The loss of a large transmission line or the loss of a large generator, you need to very quickly bring stuff on. Fast start capacity in reserve is part of the response to those types of events. Fast start capacity in reserve could also be used as part of a response to output swings from solar and renewable resources, although not as fast starting or operating resources that still have headroom can also be used and are used to ramp up and down to respond to what the changing conditions are on the system. The type of units that can come on quickly, the paragraph continues, are typically natural gas generators and large-scale pump storage. Well, those are not the only resources. That's definitely true. But we also have imports that can come on relatively quickly. And as we look into the future, we have storage resources that have not yet been commercialized to any extent in New England. But those are flexible, dispatchable resources. So yes, it's true that units can come on quickly, natural gas generators. What that sentence is also referring to is not necessarily new units. It could be referring to the existing resource base of natural gas generators. Absolutely.
So the Invenergy project is a natural gas generator of the type that is being referred to in this paragraph. Would you agree?
Yes, as is most of the rest of the natural gas resource base in New England.
I would move this exhibit as a full.
I would have two comments about the exhibit. One is that Mr. Shore reflected that this is dated in March of 2015. That's not correct. The date is on page 3, which doesn't appear in this exhibit. And I just want to note for the record that there is a more recent 2016 regional electricity outlook that is not an exhibit. CLF has no objection to the exhibit being admitted full.
Are there any objections? May be admitted fully.
Now, would you agree with me that the ISO New England has capacity credits for renewable resources?
Yes, they characterize the capacity value of renewable resources. Yeah, absolutely.
And would you agree that the capacity credit commitments for a capacity credit that ISO has identified for wind is 10%? Does that number sound accurate to you?
I don't know exactly what that number is. I would have thought that the default number was a little bit higher, and I also would have thought that in general, they look at existing historical data from those resources to determine what the specific capacity credit might be for any given wind resource. And I'll also note that the wind resource that might be in that range is an onshore wind resource. Offshore wind resources would have a significantly higher capacity credit than onshore wind resources.
So you're saying you're not sure if the ISO New England specific credit for with the wind resource is 10%?
Offhand, no, it's an empirical question. It's fairly straightforward to find out. I can certainly respond to it after the fact if that's permissible, but I wouldn't want to just agree with you on that number until I have it, get the chance to sort of refresh my knowledge of the specific characterization of wind capacity credits that ISO New England uses in its tariff.
Does that sound close to accurate?
I think, as I indicated, it sounds a little bit low. I would have said 15% if you had to put me on the spot.
And in solar, my understanding is solar, the specific credit for the solar resource is 35%. Does that sound about right?
Now that I can be a little bit more specific on. In the ISO New England CELT, there is there's a forecast of what that credit will be. That starts more like 40%, it ramps down to something like 36%. But I'll admit that might be the credit that they assign to behind the meter generation. Somewhere in the range of 35 to 40% is not an unreasonable number to use for capacity accreditation for solar. New York State, for example, has, I think, greater detail. They allow up to slightly in the low 40s, depending on the characteristics of the solar resource, the tilt, for example, and which direction it's facing.
Thank you. Now, turning to your CLF Exhibit 20, the one to list the retirements, the one page.
Yes.
You list Brayton Point at the top as an at-risk project. You see that?
Yes.
Let them pose the question.
You list that project as an at-risk, correct?
I do. That was ISO New England's characterization of these types of units.
Are you aware that the Brayton Point project has announced that it does plan to retire?
Yes, I indicate this on this page.
Okay. And you list several units on this at-risk portion of the document here. The list including projects like Merrimack 1 and 2, Newington 1, Schiller 4 and 6, and Yarmouth 1, 2, 3, and 4. You see those?
I do.
And we totaled those up as 1796 megawatts. Is that your understanding?
If you repeat them, I can do the math on the numbers that I have here, which represent ISO New England summer seasonal claim capability.
Commissioner, if it helps, I could offer the witness a calculator.
That's fine.
Sure.
Yes?
Yes,
Please.
that was a yes.
Thank you.
Can you just repeat which ones
Yeah.
you want to know the subtotal for?
I'd like to get a subtotal for Merrimack 1 and 2, Newington 1, Schiller 4 and 6, and Yarmouth 1, 2, 3, and 4.
$1,744 megawatts.
1,744 is your calculation?
That's correct.
Okay. Do you know the status of these facilities?
I know that they have capacity supply obligations for FCA 10. Beyond that, I know that they are tagged as at-risk units, and I also know that the New Hampshire PUC is in the process of trying to sell them, I believe.
Excuse me, what was that last statement again?
The New Hampshire PUC is in the process of trying to figure out how, I believe it's Eversource, can sell these units. I'm sorry, the ones in New Hampshire, not Durham.
So, am I correct that the New Hampshire PUC has authorized the owners of these projects to divest those assets?
I think that's probably a correct characterization, yes.
Thank you. And what would be the impact if those assets, in fact, are retired and you divest, are sold? What would be the impact?
Objection, there seems to be conflating of divestiture with retirement, and I would appreciate it if the question could be cleaned up to make the distinction clear.
I meant if they are sold, if they are in fact divested.
I don't know what happens if they are sold.
Well, they will not be available to supply any energy or capacity in the future, correct?
I don't know. Depends on what happens to them when they're sold.
Depends on, it depends on what happens with the new ownership, you're saying?
Yeah, it's a straightforward question. If they're retired, they're no longer available to provide capacity. If they're not retired, they are available to provide capacity. I don't know what the status of them will be pursuant to whatever sale process may happen going forward. All I know is that they currently have a capacity supply obligation for 2019-20.
And these are projects that you've identified as at risk. When you mean at risk, you're meaning at risk for retirement, correct?
Yes, I have not identified them as at risk. ISO New England has identified them as at risk. I've provided this documentation to sort of make the record clear on what the situation is with the units that ISO New England has designated as at risk, older steam units in New England.
And with these resources that we just discussed, were they also awarded a capacity supply obligation in FCA number 9?
I don't know that offhand.
Now, you mentioned, we looked at Bridgeport Harbor 3 is also on your list. Do you see that?
Yes.
And are you aware that Bridgeport number 3 is projected to retire in 2021 when the new Bridgeport Harbor combined cycle project comes online?
I'm not aware of the detail around that, no.
Do you believe that that plant, the Bridgeport Harbor 3, is going to continue to operate in perpetuity?
I have no knowledge to inform myself on that question right now. I'm sorry. Can I check my answer? In perpetuity?
Correct.
No, I don't think anything on this list operates in perpetuity.
Have you done any economic analysis on these at-risk units yourself?
No, that's not at all part of my testimony.
If these projects do in fact retire, have you determined what the capacity price would be in the market if they did retire?
No, I've not done a forecast of capacity prices, just like I have not also done a forecast of possible additions, which would likely have an incentive to come into the market in parallel with retirement of at-risk units.
And assuming that these assets also try to get a capacity obligation in FCA 11, is it possible that some of these existing resources that have been identified as at risk may not clear the FCA 11, even though they have not announced a formal retirement?
I think that's a possibility, but I have not done any analysis of the likelihood of such an event occurring.
So these are assumed at risk and projects that you've identified in this.
As I stated before, this is not my assumption. ISO New England tagged these as at risk. I put this exhibit together just to make it clear for the record the size, the location, and the status of these key units.
Okay. Now, if you turn to page 29 of your pre-filed testimony, I believe this was figure 12 that you were referring to a few minutes earlier.
Yes.
And I'd like to first point out, this chart is, you're attempting to show a forecast of resource surplus or shortage or through mid-20s, through 2025, correct?
No, I'm not attempting to show that ISO New England has shown that in this table in the regional system plan.
And am I correct that on the left column where you describe, say, 50/50 peak load, do you see that?
Yes,
And that's the ISO, these numbers are taken from ISO New England, correct?
that's correct. This is based on the current ISO New England forecast at the time they put together the 2015 regional system plan, which was based on 2015 SALT.
Okay, and the beginning number in 2020-21 is 30,182, do you see that?
That's correct.
And if we scroll down, the numbers progress slightly higher in 2021-22 to 30,487, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then in 2022-23, slightly higher again, 30,804, correct?
Yes,
And then 2023-2024, slightly higher again at 31,131, correct?
yes,
And finally, slightly higher again, 2024, 31,455, correct?
yes.
So those peak load statistics are trending upwards, correct?
That's correct in this table,
Understood.
based on FCA 9. But the context here, as I make very clear in my question and answer on page 29 at the bottom, beginning line 16, is that it does not include the most recent updates to both load and solar PV, and therefore it's essentially superseded by the 2016 SELT.
So is this table inaccurate? You're saying that this table is now no longer accurate?
Objection, that mischaracterizes his testimony.
Overruled is cross-examination.
No, I wouldn't say that this table is inaccurate. I would say it is now outdated. And at the time that it was published, it was accurate for what they knew at the time. And as I clearly state in testimony, the information here can now and should now be updated with the information based on the 2016 SALT. Things change, ISO New England takes that into account.
Now, am I correct that when you put this table together, you...
Objection.
Can I finish the question?
His testimony is that he didn't put the table together.
He didn't finish the question. No, let him finish the question.
When you use this table, I'll rephrase the question. On this page in your testimony, there are some assumptions I see in here. Am I correct that one of the assumptions that you used or is stated in this document here is that I'm looking at specifically at footnote B, little b. It says that the FCA number 9 resource numbers are based on FCI 9 auction results, assuming no retirements, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So what would happen if let me rephrase that. So the list of projects on your Exhibit 20, Mr. Fagan. Let's assume that some of these projects received a capacity obligation, CSO and FCA 9. The reference in this chart here is assuming that there will be no retirements. If, in fact, one of these resources that did receive a commitment supply obligation in FCA 9 does retire, what would happen to the surplus or shortage number?
I'm sorry, that was a compound question. Could you,
Sure.
the beginning portion of it,
Let me try that again.
you said something about what this is.
Okay, Mr. Fagan, he's going to restate the question.
Yeah. In here, we identified some projects in CLF 20, correct?
ISO New England identified these units a while ago as at risk, and this exhibit states the current status of those units.
And do you know, you said you don't know if any of these were awarded a CSO and FCI 9, correct?
I don't know that offhand.
assuming that they were, for the sake of the discussion here, assuming that they were, and they in fact do retire, the surplus shortage number on the 2025 chart here would change, correct?
Yes, you can make any assumption about what gets retired, what gets added, and the surplus shortage numbers will change.
And on little D note, the ISO document that you're referencing here says additional resources would be required. Additional resources would be required if additional resources retired or less capacity imports obtains CSOs. Do you see that?
I see that.
Now, there were some questions with regard to the annual configuration auctions. Do you recall that earlier today?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. If I recall, you mentioned that call them ARAs. Is that the term?
Annual reconfiguration auctions, yes.
And you mentioned that they are in place to balance the potential changes in the need. That is the NICR over the 3-year time period. Is that correct?
Not quite. I didn't say that they were a place to balance the need. I think I said they were a place to balance the resources. Part of what ISO New England does for each ARA is recompute what the need is. They recompute the ICR, what the net ICR.
And do you expect that need would decrease as we approach the the capability year for FCA 10?
Are we talking about a capacity
FCA 10
commitment
is already
period?
passed.
Okay.
One at a time.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. Do you expect that the need would decrease as we approach the capability year for FCA 10?
I'd like to inquire if we're talking about the capacity commitment period or CCP.
Talking about yes. Yeah.
My testimony has been that the ICR, preliminary ICR for FCA 11, is lower than what it is for FCA 10. The rest of my testimony does talk about trending, flattening or downward trending of net peak load. That in general implies that ICRs would go down. I don't have specific knowledge of exactly what ISO New England is putting together for its ICR or net ICRs for the annual reconfiguration auctions associated with the FCA 10. Yes, I would expect them to remain the same or to reduce. Well, there's a greater likelihood that they would remain the same or be lower than they would, for example, be increased. But I don't know. They have not done that yet.
Have you done any specific analysis on the potential change on this?
I have not done specific analysis or specific forecasting of net ICR. What I rely upon is ISO New England projections of load as being a very relevant factor in what their projection of ICR might be in the future, and that the trends are such that the peak load projection in any given year for any given future year has been lower. But peak load projection is not the only factor, so there may be other factors that would also influence what that ICR number might be. But all else equal, I think that there's a greater chance that it remains the same or slightly decreased based on what we've seen between FCA 10 and the forecast for FCA 11. The preliminary forecast.
And the NICR could also increase as we approach the FCA 10 CCO, the commencement date, correct?
Well, it's possible, but like I said, I thought that there was a greater likelihood that it would stay the same or it would decrease than it would increase.
I want to turn your attention to the, I think it was page, let's get the note here. Give me a second here. Page 9, I think it's of your testimony. I believe you were asked this question or earlier. On line 6, beginning on line 6, you make a statement that the FCN construct, through its FCAs and bilateral contracting arrangements, represent procurement arrangements, but they do not determine need. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, have you, do you have Mr. Hardy's rebuttal testimony there with you?
I thought I did, but I don't think I do, but I think I'm about to get it.
You see that?
Yes.
Please turn to Exhibit A, which is titled The Introduction to New England's Forward Capacity Market. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then please turn to what is page 3 of that document, where the heading is Forward Capacity Market. Do you see that?
Yes.
The first sentence says, the forward capacity market is a long-term wholesale market that assures resource adequacy locally and system-wide. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then it goes on to say, the market is designed to promote economic investment in supply and demand resources where they are needed most. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now turn to Exhibit D, which is a press release from the ISO New England. Tell me when you get there.
Yes, I'm there.
Would you please read the first paragraph of that ISO press release?
February 2016, New England's annual capacity auction concluded Monday with sufficient resources to meet demand in 2019-2020 at a lower price and with more than 1,400 megawatts of new generating capacity that will help replace recently retired and retiring generators. The auction is run by the ISO New England, Inc. to provide the resources that will be needed to meet projected demand 3 years in the future.
The last sentence says the auction is run by ISO New England, Inc. to procure the resources that will be needed to meet projected demand 3 years in the future, correct?
Yes, that's what it says.
Would you please turn to Mr. Stix's testimony, if you have a copy of that, on page 7.
I don't have a copy of Mr. Stix's testimony.
Free file. Thank you, Senator. Page 7.
Yes.
I want you to see. I want you to look on page 7, line 6, at the end of that, where the sentence begins. The purpose of these FCAs is basically to make sure there will be enough electricity, that is, enough power generation capacity here in New England to meet the expected load during that future 1-year period. Do you see that?
Yes.
Would you agree that when Mr. Stix is making that statement, he's referencing expected load to mean the future need for electric power in the ISO New England market, correct?
Objection.
I don't think Mr. Fagan has any knowledge of what Mr. Sticks meant when he wrote that sentence. Mr. Sticks is going to be cross-examined this afternoon, and Mr. Shore can ask Mr. Sticks about what he had in mind.
Could you read back this question for me?
It's pretty straightforward. He's talking about procurement to meet need.
Okay.
The need is set by ICR, and he's talking about the procurements.
Do you agree with his statement that the purpose of the FCA is to basically make sure there will be enough electricity, that is, enough power generation capacity here in New England to meet the expected load during that future one-year period? Do you agree with that statement?
I don't agree fully with the statement. I agree that that's part of what's going on, but the procurement process is more comprehensive than just the single 3-year forward FCA.
So you disagree with Mr. Sticks with reference to that
I
statement?
think I clarified.
Objection.
It's cross-examination. I gave you plenty of latitude yesterday. Overruled.
Mr. Sticks talked about it in the context of the 3-year forward auction. As I have indicated, the procurement process consists of more than just the 3-year forward auction. I don't think there's anything that's a mystery here. There's a projection of ICR. Those projections can change. There's a procurement process that as a first step, sort of, is the forward capacity auction 3 years in advance. And then there's other things happen as you get closer into the capacity commitment period.
So when you're referencing a statement that the resource that obtains a capacity supply obligation is, as I think you put it in your words, a financial obligation, but it's not physically needed for reliability, that statement is contrary to what the ISO New England and Mr. Sticks just stated. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I would not.
Well, am I correct that the capacity supply obligation is an obligation that's put on the entity to have the capacity physically available during the FCA delivery year, and would incur a financial penalty if that capacity is unavailable?
You use the word physically. I would say, no, that's not the case. It is an obligation, and it is an obligation that is somewhat fungible in the out years. As you get closer to the capacity commitment period, it becomes, I won't say it becomes less fungible, but basically it becomes physical as you get to the capacity commitment period, and you actually are using the resource, if it exists, to offer into New England's energy markets. But that's a different thing than what that obligation is in July of 2016 for the summer of 2019.
Well, if it's only a financial obligation, as I believe was your testimony, and not a physical obligation, as you claim, then is there another mechanism in the ISO New England system to select and add new generation capacity beyond the FCA?
The mechanism is the process that we've already talked about. You have a series of reconfiguration options. If for whatever reason any of the resources that hold a CSO are not able to meet that obligation, they participate in the annual reconfiguration process. The ISO New England continues to update its forecast for what need is, and you get to real time. It's somewhat straightforward. I mean, for example, ISO New England granted a CSO to Footprint Power a number of years back, and it was originally for the summer of 2016. It's now the summer of 2016, and Footprint Power is now up and operating. So, that's but one example, and not necessarily analogous to this situation, but it is an example of a resource that had a CSO, and it comes to the capacity commitment period, it's not there. The system's reliable in the summer of 2016. Clearly, I believe Cape Wind also had a CSO, if I'm not mistaken.
My question is, is there another mechanism in place other than the FCA process right now?
The FCA process is the mechanism. It consists of more than just the 3-year forward FCA option. It consists of the reconfiguration options and bilateral opportunities, both of those on an annual and a monthly basis, in the period between when the 3-year option concludes and the capacity commitment period commences.
If a significant portion of companies that hold CSOs do not ultimately show up during the delivery year, would you agree that the ISO New England system would be at risk for unreliability?
Sure, that's your hypothetical. You have to define what you mean by significant. If by significant you meant, say, 1,000 megawatts, I would say, no, 1,000 megawatts wouldn't be a problem, given what we know now, because there was a 1,400 megawatt surplus. The fact of the matter is, as I indicate on Exhibit CLF 20, there's 35,000 megawatts of capacity supply obligations out there for FCA 10. And you have ICR projections that are that between FCA 10 and FCA 11 declined a bit. There's room for a lot of that. If you look at the attachment to my testimony, there is a page from the 2016 CELT that I believe is included as tab B. And I'll take this time to point out on that tab, which is from the CELT report in 2016, section 1.1, summer peak capabilities and load forecast. If you go right to the bottom line, 4.2.2, percentage of load, where it says installed reserves, and you look at those numbers, what you see, and those are effectively planning reserve, that's the margin that ISO New England thinks exists right now, based on the capacity. When you get to 2019, that number jumps from 23 up to 26%. That's an indication that right now, they're a little bit long, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, depending on your perspective, but it certainly indicates that there's quite a bit of room for not having all of those obligations come to fruition physically.
Well, if none of the generators who receive the CSO obligation show up and deliver their resource, would you agree that there would be a system reliability problem?
Sure, but that's a pathological hypothetical. You've got a whole asset base out there that are in the money effectively, and they're not going to retire. And my testimony is not a careful analysis of what units are on the margin and what's going to retire and when. The point that I'm making is there's not a reliability need for this plant. And right now, and there's an indication that there's 1,400 megawatts of surplus in 2019. That's the facts as they exist today.
Well, isn't it reasonable then to assume that the CSO, the capacity supply obligation, even if you take your view that it's a financial instrument, isn't it reasonable to assume that that ultimately results in a physical obligation that ties to the reliability on the ISO New England system?
No, that's not a reasonable assumption at all. If you were to make that assumption going forward, when we got to 2019, we would have 26% projected reserve, probably even higher than 26% projected reserve if the loads are actually lower than what they were projected to be in 2015. So no, I don't think it's a reasonable thing to think that all of those CSOs would necessarily come to physical completion at the beginning of the capacity commitment period, especially as it pertains to to new resources,
Mr.
possibly to at-risk.
Mr. Fagan, I thought I heard you say earlier that as you get closer to the FCA delivery year, that CSO becomes a physical obligation. Am I correct if that's what you said earlier?
I think I may have used the phrase more physical. In other words, as you get closer in time, ISO New England wants to shore up what capacity resources are available for 2 summers from now, 1 summer from now.
Would you please turn to Mr. Parker's testimony on page 14? See that testimony?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first, am I correct that in FCA number 9, the ISO New England awarded capacity obligations, let's call it a surplus above the NICR, the FCA number 9, is that correct?
I don't know offhand, as I indicated earlier.
And for FCA 10, the ISO New England awarded capacity obligations in a surplus capacity or in a surplus amount above the NICR, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, Mr. Parker's testimony on page 13, there's a question on the bottom here. The question is, does the fact that SCNE cleared above the LSR in FCA 10 have any impact on CRC's need determination? Do you see that?
Yes.
And the SCNE is the zone we're talking about, the Southeast New England zone, correct?
This is Mr. Parker's testimony.
Okay. What's your understanding of that term, SCNE?
SCNE stands for Southeastern New England. It is a defined zone, an ISO New England defined zone for capacity purposes.
Okay. And you see Mr. Parker's statement where the answer begins on line 22. He says, no, the SNEE-NELSR value represents the minimum amount of capacity needed in that capacity zone given its projected load and limited transmission import capabilities. Did you see that?
You see that sentence? Yes.
Do you agree with that sentence?
Yes, I wouldn't write it the same way. I wouldn't use the word limited, but yes, I agree with the sentence.
Okay. And am I correct, then when you turn to page 14 in Mr. Parker's testimony, it's a footnote number 5. See that? See that footnote number 5?
Yes. Can I read the sentence in the footnote, please?
Please do.
Why don't we, for the record, have an indication of what LSR means?
What is your understanding of what LSR means, Mr. Fagan?
I believe the acronym is Global Sourcing Requirement. Sorry, you had a question?
Yes. The last sentence of that footnote, which says the system must meet both resource adequacy
and transmission security requirements. You see that statement?
Yes, I do.
Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, I do.
Why don't we at this time take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back at about 5 after and go until 1, at which point we'll break for lunch. Is that good?